A young father with a rare form of lung cancer who's been turned down for a transplant by several hospitals. A kid who is considered not smart enough to be worthy of a transplant. A young mother dying on the waiting list in front of her two small children. These are the types of experiences faced by transplant surgeons every day. Burnout rates are high in healthcare professionals, and this episode gives us insights into the unique challenges that they face. But it also gives us insights into the common challenges we all face across all professions. Today I'm joined by Dr David Weill. He's the former director of the Lung and Heart-Lung Transplant Program at Stanford University Medical Center. He now provides assistance to transplant programs across the country, and he's also the author of 2 books. Hey there. Welcome to the Burnout Isn't Necessary podcast, where we delve into the world of stress, burnout, and the science behind it all. Over a decade ago, I faced burnout as a management consultant, experiencing an emptiness that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But here's the truth. My burnout wasn't necessary, and it's not necessary for you either. I'm Hannah Holden, and together with my amazing guests, we share our real-life experiences with stress and burnout. We explore the science behind stress, offering practical tips to help you navigate those challenging moments in life. Our goal? To empower you to prevent burnout from taking over your life. I am passionate about stress mastery and preventing burnout, and I am here to guide you to a more balanced, fulfilling life. So let's go. Burnout isn't necessary, and I'm here to show you why. So David, welcome.
Thank you, Hannah. I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, you've published 2 books which very much draw upon your real-life experiences as a transplant surgeon. Can you give us some insights into your career, your successes, and your ultimate burnout in that career, which led you to where you are today?
Yeah, so my job for most of my career was to run the Stanford Transplant program, where I cared for a lot of patients with life-threatening diseases. And as such, I got really involved with both the patient themselves and also their family. And the involvement got to the extent that I was so personally invested and felt such a strong sense of personal responsibility to them that I no longer, as my career went on, could accept when we would lose a patient. And losing patients, unfortunately, is very much a part of what we do. And my ability to handle it diminished as time went on, actually. And that's often the opposite of what really happens. Sometimes you get better at that, quote unquote. I didn't. And as time went on, I could no longer really tolerate a patient not surviving our transplant operation. And so I suffered from what I now know as compassion fatigue or empathy depletion. And it made it untenable, really, for me to continue in that role. So I stepped aside.
I mean, I think it's extreme for transplant doctors like yourself, but burnout levels are high in healthcare professionals. And what you've just described, I think, gives us some insight as to why that is. I think that I've never really considered just the emotional toll it would take to be a doctor, a transplant surgeon, until you and I started talking. But I think that some of what you've described could go some way to explaining why burnout is so high in healthcare professionals. Do you think that there are other aspects of healthcare that contribute to the high burnout levels?
I do. And I actually went around when my first book was published to, I think, 75 medical centers and gave talks of various sorts about my experience. And I was finding out that I wasn't alone, that the healthcare workforce was experiencing things very similar to what I was experiencing. But what I also found out that even though I thought it was an internal problem, in other words, it was me just not being able to kind of handle it anymore, I found out very much that it's an external problem. In other words, the healthcare workforce has to work in an ecosystem right now where the values of the workforce themselves are misaligned from the people that are running the healthcare. And I think that's particularly true in America, although I do think it's an international problem as well. And then I started meeting up with other kind of groups, other professionals, whether they were stock traders on Wall Street or they were airline pilots, and they were experiencing much the same thing. But I think it was particularly severe in the healthcare workforce because of the broken healthcare system, especially in America right now.
And let's look at that values misalignment that you just mentioned. So could you dig into that a little bit deeper, what you've witnessed and what you experienced?
Yeah, I think the American healthcare system, and I say this with no amount of glee, is really a profits over purpose system. I think that everywhere you turn in healthcare, and of course we've had this tragic shooting in the United States recently of a healthcare executive in the insurance industry, but everywhere you turn, money is the predominant concern in healthcare. And I think that patients are starting to realize that they're incredibly frustrated by it, but the healthcare workers themselves are the ones that have to deal with this every single day, seeing more patients at less compensation, being told how to practice medicine by insurance companies. All of these different factors are working on the healthcare workforce. So the joy in providing, life-saving therapy to patients, as I did, is really lost. And I think that that's not only a concern for the healthcare worker herself, but it's really a concern for the patient. It should be, because what's gradually happening is more and more people are looking to leave medicine, whether they're nurses or doctors or other professionals, and that's bad for patients.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something else that struck me about your experience was that you didn't really have a formal outlet to explore your emotions and your experiences as things evolved with patients. And so you relied heavily on your own writing, on journaling, and on capturing your experiences as an outlet. But that was something that occurred to me, that there didn't seem to be, you were there to support the patients and their families, but there wasn't really a structure or anything formal there to support you. Would you agree with that?
I would agree wholeheartedly with that. And I think it was especially true before COVID. I think what's interesting is that some of the hospitals that I work with in the consulting role are now paying a lot of attention to the mental well-being of the healthcare workforce. And there's some systems that have been put in place that I think are helpful. I don't think that's universally true, but it's a lot better, I would say, than it was maybe 10 years ago when I was experiencing some of the problems that I was having. Mm-hmm. And I think it's much more accepted now for a healthcare worker to go to his or her colleagues and talk about it, something that I really never did, especially as leader of the team. I went to quite a high degree of trying to hide my own struggles. I just didn't think at that time that it was a good idea for me to indicate to the rest of the team that I was struggling. That was a mistake on my part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, you found writing or journaling as an outlet for your emotional experiences, but that then also contributed to your first book. So your first book, Exhale, was a memoir. And with your permission, I'd like to read a quote from that, because I think whilst we've talked about your experiences, I think there's nothing like the words that you used there and then in the moment as you were experiencing it for listeners to really understand what you went through. And so the excerpt that I'd like to share is this. Mother of two, couldn't find a lung in time, died on the waiting list, talked to her husband and kids, told them she wasn't going to make it, went into a hospital supply closet and cried. And I think I've got a lump in my throat now. When I first read those words, for me, that was a real penny dropping moment of what we've just been talking about, what we've been, to use the words to describe the situation doesn't quite do service, I think, than those words that you used and you wrote down there and then in the moment of your true experience. I think that really conveys what we've just been talking about, and brings it to life. And so is there anything else that you'd like to bring to light from your memoir or from your experiences before I ask you more questions about your more recent book.
Yeah, I think that passage that you just read was very typical of how I journaled. In other words, you know, I didn't have the time or inclination or sometimes even the words to put my emotions into prose, to long paragraphs, to pages and pages of journal entries. So it almost felt like, as you were reading that I was bullet pointing, what I had experienced, because I was bullet pointing what I experienced. And I think I'm glad I did that, because I got down, even in those short little phrases, the essence of what I was going through. And then I could go back for my first book and try to write more words around it to describe the feeling. But yeah, I think that was very typical of how I journaled back then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of have an image of you between having one conversation, knowing that you need to go into surgery, or knowing that you need to get in your car and drive home or move on to the next thing, and yet you weren't ready. There wasn't that space for you to process, and so you took yourself off to journal this and cry in the supply closet. Like I picture you not having the space, the time, the people to be able to go through that process, and that's how. So of course it was in bullet points, of course it was brief, of course I can't imagine it being a scenario where you were trying to write a novel at that time.
Right, that's exactly right. I think that was the best I could do, and I remember carrying that journal around for years, really, and writing when I could. And sometimes it was at home, sometimes it was in the hospital, sometimes it was in the privacy of my own office. But I still think, for me, that's the best way to do it, is to write it. But that doesn't mean that's the best way for everybody, but that was the best way for me.
Mm-hmm. I think, I resonate with that. I find journaling really powerful when I'm going through something, because I like to be able to begin to process it and begin to figure it out and piece it together on my own before I share it with somebody. So yeah, for me it feels right. But like you say, everybody's different. So your latest book is a fictional book, with Dr. Joe Bosco as the central character. Can you describe who he is and what success looks like for him, and the challenges that he faces?
Yeah, Joe Bosco is a hard-driving, arrogant transplant surgeon who has very high expectations set upon him by first his parents and then really by himself. He began to read his own press, if you will, and had a very steep rise in his career, and then got himself into quite a bit of trouble. And then I spend the last part of the novel trying to see how and if he can get out of it. I was inspired to write this character because, even though I described some of these situations in my memoir, I felt like a fictional setting gave me more latitude to explore all of what I saw in the hospital. And essentially everything that I wrote about in my novel, I experienced one way or the other. And that kind of freedom, without worrying about sensitivities of patients and people I worked with, really was liberating. And I'm glad I got the chance to write it, and glad that a publisher was willing to publish it.
And what would you say we learn? We've talked a little about the experiences of transplant surgeons, and so obviously this book is going to go deeper into that. But what else do we learn from reading this book?
I think one can learn quite a bit about expectations. I think expectations are a very difficult part of many people's lives, including mine at times. And I think that it's fine to set expectations high and to pursue them. We tell our children to do that, to do that. What I think is very difficult is when our expectations become so outsized that we can't possibly attain them. And then when we do attain them, we push the goalpost even further higher and higher. And so we're constantly chasing these expectations. And so, in fact, I start the book, ironically, we were just talking about journaling, with Joe Bosco journaling, presumably out of his normal setting, and I won't give away too much, but journaling about how difficult expectations have been in his life. So I think one of the major themes of this book is really about how we deal with our own expectations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I know that we talked about this before, but I'm wondering what your answer is going to be this time. How would you describe what you think your message is for the world now, based on, you've written 2 books and all of the experiences you have? What would you say your message is?
I think it can be fairly easily summarized. Slow down. I think what happens is, and every incentive we have in this world is to go faster. And I think we're doing that, with social media. We do that with the internet. We do that with the news cycle. We do that with our political structure. We do that in the pursuit of our careers. We even do that taking care of our children. We keep on speeding up. And what happens as we do that is we really lost the essence for why we're here. And we've lost that contemplative time. And one thing I've learned since I decided to take a different direction in my life now 8 years ago, when I left Stanford, was that if I was going to be happy, if I was going to really have a chance at that, I was going to have to slow down my mind, my body, my thought process, everything about me, in order to really savor what was most important to me. And sometimes I succeed at that, and sometimes I don't. But I think it's important that we really do that, because, like I said, everything in our society is telling us to speed up.
The title of your novel is All That Really Matters, and do you think that is also is connected to the message that you just described?
I do, because I don't think we can really properly find out all that really matters without slowing down. I think while we're going 110 miles an hour, it's very difficult to touch upon what really matters to us. I think it's impossible, at least it was for me. And I think the reason I titled the book that way is my main character was going to have to, either by force or not by force, slow down in order to really figure out what was most important to him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. That I think is a common theme for individuals experiencing burnout, that they have found themselves to some extent on some kind of autopilot, where they're doing more of the same things that used to deliver them success, the same things that used to bring them joy, but they haven't necessarily taken a step back to reevaluate where they are with their life and what matters and what their values are, what their personal values are, because your personal values can change over time, especially if you have significant life changes like having children. Suddenly things shift, but also what was the right answer and aligned to those values isn't necessarily aligned over time. So things like investing in your career to the extent that you compromise everything else might be the right thing and aligned to your values at one point, but then not necessarily for the long term. So I think that's it's a common theme with people who experience burnout.
Yeah, Hannah, I hadn't really thought of it that way in terms of the temporal relationship, but I think you're absolutely right. I think those of us that, pursued our career in our 20s and 30s say, with absolute vigor, maybe that's not quite the way when, you get married and you have relationships and you have children, and things change over time. And I guess that adjustment is what's required, really. Something that I think I struggled with, particularly in my 40s and early 50s.
Yeah, and especially I think linking back to your conversation about expectations, especially if we think we've set expectations with everybody around us, colleagues being a good example. If there's an expectation that you work late, that you go above and beyond, that that you've established a way of working in your career, and that's made you successful to this date, and you've always done it and there's never been a complaint. Trying to change things at that point becomes really difficult, because you feel like you're going to let people down. They expect you to be your usual self and to carry on as you were.
That sounds right to me, and I've got personal experience with all of that. So yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those were all of my questions. I think that I've got a few takeaways from our conversations. So I'll admit this isn't the first time we've attempted to record a podcast, and the technical error last time was entirely my fault. But it does mean that I've had more time to reflect on the conversations that we've had. One of the things that stood out for me was around organ donor conversations with families. And for those of us, I have an organ donor card, but to what extent have I had that conversation with my family, and the knock-on effect that could potentially have, to the families that you've described working with. So that was one. I think it's very easy to not recognize the pressure that healthcare professionals are under. And I think it's really valuable for those of us who are not in healthcare and who interact with healthcare providers to just be aware of what they're, it's not just about workload, but the emotional toll that's associated with the work that they do. I've got a deeper appreciation for that based on the conversations we've had, and reinforcement around how powerful journaling is, because I've found it to be helpful, and found it really interesting to listen to you describe how you've used it and how that helped you. So those were my takeaways from our conversations, and feel free to add to those or comment on those.
No, I think those are spot on, and I appreciate you taking the time to consider all of what we talked about. I think all of those are really so important, and I actually, in my writing space, have a little sticky note that says slowly, because even when you're trying to write, you can hurry that process, and I have to remind myself of that all the time, not just in my writing but in my life. So I appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your time and your messages with me and with my audience. Both of David's books, so his memoir is called Exhale and his novel is called All That Really Matters. Both of them are available on Amazon. And if you'd like to find out more about David and his books, you can find him at www.davidweill.com, and Weill is spelled Weill. So I'll include the links in the show notes. And thank you again, David, for sharing your experiences. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for being part of Burnout Isn't Necessary. Our aim is to assist you in navigating stress and preventing burnout. If you found our conversations valuable, please consider subscribing and taking a moment to rate the podcast. Your feedback is essential. I want to hear from you. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, share them with me. Your input can shape the content that we create. A common question I receive is where to start in managing stress, and everything starts with awareness. Stress impacts each of us in a unique way, and some stress symptoms can seem a little random, so I've created a checklist of symptoms to help you better understand how stress shows up for you. There's a link in the show notes. And a quick reminder, this podcast is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only. It's not a substitute for professional advice. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, take care of yourself.